Kiss me once before the ceremony, the Alpha King whispered, and the Omega's choice stole his breath. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, back to Elena Moore. The Hall of Stone breathed softly in the hour before dawn, its tall arches catching the last silver of the moon, while torches burned low along the walls, steady and patient, as if they too understood the weight of what was about to happen. And Elena stood where she had been told to stand, just off the main line of sight, hands folded, spine straight, the polished floor cool beneath her thin shoes, the air carrying the faint chill of a northern morning that would have read barely 40 degrees Fahrenheit if anyone had thought to measure it, though no one measured anything tonight except worth and destiny. And she had been measured many times already and always found wanting, an Omega present but not presented, invited but never invited to hope. Across the vast space, the ceremonial doors remained closed, yet the pressure of the waiting pack pressed in from every side. Whispers restrained to murmurs, breaths carefully controlled, because everyone knew the Alpha King would arrive exactly when he chose, not a second sooner or later. And when Rowan Blackthorn finally stepped through those doors, time itself seemed to adjust around him, the room subtly leaning in, shoulders squared, chins lifted, as if the building recognized its ruler. Before the people did. Elena did not look up right away, not because she was afraid, but because she had learned that being unseen was safer, and still she felt it. The moment his presence crossed the threshold, a change in the air like the drop before a storm, a quiet authority that did not need to announce itself. And when she finally raised her eyes, just enough to orient herself, she found that his gaze was already there, resting on her with an attention that did not match her place in the hall. Rowan Blackthorn was taller than she had imagined, broad-shouldered, composed, his expression calm in a way that suggested control rather than coldness. And when his eyes met hers, something unspoken passed between them, not a command, not a promise, but a pause, as if the world had briefly forgotten its next line. The ceremonial attendants shifted, confused by the delay, but Rowan moved forward with deliberate ease, closing the distance measured in feet that felt far longer than it was, until he stood just close enough that his voice, when he spoke, belonged only to her, low and steady, carrying no heat, no threat, only intention, and he whispered the words that would follow her long after this night ended, asking for a single kiss before the ceremony, as though it were the most reasonable thing in the world. And Elena did not answer right away, because for the first time, the choice was hers, entirely and unmistakably hers. And in that quiet space, with the pack holding its breath and the Alpha King waiting, she understood that whatever she decided would not just begin a ritual, it would change its meaning. Elena Moore felt the weight of the hall settle back into place after the whisper, though nothing truly returned to how it had been moments before, because awareness had shifted and could not be undone. And while Rowan Blackthorn remained close enough that she could sense the warmth of his presence without touching him, the world beyond that narrow space slowly remembered how to breathe. The ceremonial attendants exchanged restrained glances, uncertain whether to proceed or wait, and the gathered pack watched with careful stillness, not daring to interrupt a moment they did not fully understand, because the Alpha King had not stepped back and the Omega had not stepped forward, and that suspended balance told its own story. Elena kept her gaze steady, not defiant and not lowered, simply present, and for someone who had spent most of her life learning how to take up as little space as possible, the act of standing without shrinking felt strangely powerful. She remembered how she had arrived here hours earlier, guided through side corridors instead of grand entrances, reminded in polite tones where she belonged and where she did not, informed that her role tonight was ceremonial only in the loosest sense, an extra name on a list no one intended to read aloud. And yet now the Alpha King himself waited for her response while the ceremony remained paused, and the irony did not escape her. Rowan studied her face with an attention that felt thoughtful rather than possessive, as if he were learning rather than claiming. And in that observation there was patience, something few associated with his rule, something that surprised even him as he noticed it, because he had expected certainty and found himself curious instead. Elena was aware of the expectations pressing in from every side, the unspoken assumption that she would comply quickly, that gratitude would guide her choice, that proximity to power was reason enough to surrender it. But she had lived long enough under expectations to recognize them for what they were, and she inhaled slowly, feeling the cool air fill her lungs, grounding herself in the simple truth that no law and no tradition had stripped her of her will. Somewhere behind her, a bell chimed softly to mark the passing minute, and the sound echoed through the stone chamber like a reminder that time did move forward even when people hesitated. Rowan's expression shifted almost imperceptibly as that sound faded, not into impatience, but into something like respect, and he inclined his head just a fraction, a silent acknowledgement that whatever came next would be hers to decide. Elena felt the attention of the entire hall without looking away from him, and for the first time she did not feel diminished by it, because she understood that being seen did not require her to be smaller, and as she lifted her chin slightly, preparing to speak or move, she realized that this ceremony, designed to define her place before it even began, had already changed course. The Omega who had been meant to stand quietly at the edge had been brought to the center without being summoned, and the Alpha King who had been expected to command had chosen to wait, and in that subtle reversal, the rules written in stone began to soften, not breaking, but bending just enough to allow something new to emerge, something neither of them had planned, yet both could feel unfolding with each steady heartbeat. The pause stretched, not uncomfortably, but with a clarity that sharpened every detail in the chamber, from the faint crackle of torchlight to the steady rhythm of Elena Moore's breath. As she weighed what it meant to answer without being directed, and Rowan Blackthorne remained where he was, hands relaxed at his sides, posture open in a way few had ever seen from him during a formal rite. Elena was aware of the history pressing against this moment, the generations of ceremonies built on expectation rather than consent, and she understood that whatever she did now would be remembered not for how quickly it pleased the crowd, but for how honestly it reflected her will. She took a small step forward, measured and calm, not closing the distance entirely, but claiming a fraction of space that had never been offered to her before, and the movement alone sent a subtle ripple through the onlookers, because an Omega stepping forward by choice carried a meaning no script had prepared them for. Rowan's eyes followed that movement with focused attention, not possessive and not surprised, as if he had anticipated that she would meet him halfway rather than submit to the moment, and in that instant he recognized something he valued more than compliance, a steadiness that could stand beside authority instead of beneath it. Elena did not rush, did not reach out immediately, and the restraint itself spoke volumes, telling him that whatever she offered would be intentional and nothing more. And as she lifted her gaze fully to his, she saw that his composure remained intact yet altered, the slightest softening at the edges of control where curiosity and respect had taken root. The hall waited, not in impatience but in dawning realization, as though everyone present sensed that the ceremony had shifted from performance to truth, and that whatever followed would not be easily forgotten or undone. Elena spoke then, her voice clear without being loud, steady enough to carry across the stone without challenging it, and she said only that she would not be hurried. That choice required a moment to be honored, and the simplicity of the statement resonated more deeply than any formal declaration could have. Rowan inclined his head again, this time more visibly, an acknowledgement that did not diminish him but refined his authority, and in doing so he signaled to the attendants and the pack alike that this pause was permitted, protected, and meaningful. Elena felt the tension ease slightly, not because the decision had been made, but because the space to make it had been secured, and she understood that this was the true threshold, not the altar waiting behind him, but the recognition that her consent mattered here. As she moved closer, finally bridging the last measured distance, the world seemed to narrow to the space they shared, not isolating them from the crowd, but redefining their presence within it. And Rowan became acutely aware of how rarely he had allowed himself to be surprised, and how unfamiliar yet grounding it felt to stand before someone who did not seek to take from him or be taken by him, but to meet him as an equal in intention if not in title. The moment did not belong to tradition or expectation anymore. It belonged to two individuals choosing awareness over momentum, and as Elena lifted her hand slightly, not yet touching him, she understood that whatever followed would be shaped not by what was asked of her, but by what she chose to give, and that understanding alone changed everything. Elena Moore's raised hand hovered between them, not touching and not retreating, and Rowan Blackthorne felt the unusual sensation of waiting without knowing the outcome, a pause that belonged entirely to her, and yet held him just as firmly. The hall seemed to recede, its vastness softening into background awareness as the significance of the moment narrowed to breath and presence, and Rowan became conscious of details he rarely allowed himself to notice during ceremony. The steadiness of her breathing, the calm set of her shoulders, the absence of fear in her posture. Elena did not rush to complete the gesture she had begun, because she understood that meaning lived not only in action but in intention, and she allowed herself another heartbeat to listen to what her instincts were telling her, not the ones shaped by hierarchy or expectation, but the quiet inner voice that had guided her through years of being overlooked. Rowan's gaze remained fixed on her with unwavering attention, not demanding, not urging, simply open, and that openness altered the weight of his authority in a way that surprised him, because he realized that power did not diminish when it made room, it clarified itself. Around them, the pack maintained its silence, aware now that interruption would be a violation not of protocol, but of something more human, and the ceremonial attendants stood motionless, hands clasped, waiting for a cue that would not come from tradition alone. Elena felt the collective attention without being crushed by it, and in that awareness she found a steadiness she had not known she possessed, because for once she was not reacting to circumstance but shaping it. She lowered her hand slightly, not in refusal, but in recalibration, and spoke again, her voice carrying gently across the space between them as she said that whatever happened next would be by her choosing, not because she was asked, and Rowan accepted those words without defense, because they aligned with something he had long believed but rarely seen reflected back at him. He responded quietly, not with instruction, but with acknowledgement, telling her that the choice would be honored, that the ceremony could wait as long as it needed to, and those words rippled outward through the hall with unexpected impact, because an Alpha King declaring patience was more disruptive than any command. Elena felt the tension ease another degree, replaced by clarity, and as she stepped closer once more, the distance closing by inches rather than strides, she became aware of how the moment was reshaping not just her place in it, but his, because Rowan was no longer standing as a distant figure of authority, but as someone present in the uncertainty alongside her. The torches flickered softly, casting warm light that softened the edges of the stone walls, and Elena understood that this was the threshold she had never expected to cross, not into power, but into recognition, where her will carried weight simply because it was hers. Rowan felt his breath catch briefly, not from anticipation of a gesture, but from the realization that the ceremony he had presided over countless times had never felt like this, grounded and deliberate rather than inevitable, and he recognized that whatever followed would mark a turning point not just in tradition, but in himself. As Elena finally lifted her hand again, this time with intention clear and unhurried, the hall seemed to lean in once more, and Rowan knew that the moment he had initiated with a whisper had grown into something far larger, shaped now by her agency, her timing, and her choice, and he stood ready to receive it, not as a ruler expecting obedience, but as a man willing to be changed. Rowan Blackthorne realized then what he had expected when he whispered his request, not in words but in instinct, because for most of his life, moments like this had followed a familiar pattern, a quiet compliance shaped by rank, tradition, and the unspoken understanding that his presence carried its own gravity, and he had assumed that whatever followed would be simple, contained, and easily folded back into the ceremony as though nothing had truly changed. He had expected acknowledgement, a brief gesture that would confirm the path already laid out, something symbolic enough to satisfy the ritual without challenging it, and he had not questioned that expectation until it failed to materialize. Standing there now, watching Elena Moore move with careful intention rather than reflex, he felt the first crack in that assumption, a realization that the outcome he had envisioned belonged to habit, not inevitability. Elena, meanwhile, was acutely aware of what the Alpha King likely believed this moment would be, because she had seen versions of it play out before from a distance, where choice was assumed rather than exercised, and she recognized that his request, while softly spoken, still carried the weight of centuries of tradition that told Omegas when to step forward and when to yield. She did not resent that weight, but she refused to be shaped by it without consent, and as she stood before him, she felt the quiet strength of knowing that her hesitation had already altered the balance between them. Rowan studied her face again, this time with the clarity of someone reassessing his own expectations, and he became aware that what unsettled him was not uncertainty, but how deeply he had underestimated the significance of her agency, because the power he wielded had always responded to resistance with force or dismissal, never with reflection, and yet here he was, reflecting. The hall remained silent, but the silence had changed character, no longer tense or anticipatory, but attentive, as though the pack sensed that the true ceremony was unfolding not at the altar, but in the space between these two figures. Elena felt the moment stretch, not painfully, but meaningfully, and she recognized that Rowan's stillness was not restraint imposed by protocol, but a choice mirroring her own, and that realization grounded her further. She understood now that his request had not been a demand, but an invitation framed by expectation, and she considered carefully what it meant. To accept, refuse, or redefine it, knowing that any of those paths would echo far beyond this night. Rowan, for his part, felt his breath steady as he allowed that uncertainty to remain unresolved, because he sensed that pressing for resolution would diminish what was happening rather than complete it, and he acknowledged internally that whatever he received from her would carry weight precisely because it was not guaranteed. Elena shifted her stance slightly, a small adjustment that brought her fully into alignment with him, not above and not below, and in that movement she felt a calm resolve settle in her chest, because she was no longer reacting to his presence, but responding to her own understanding of it. Rowan noticed the change immediately, and something in his expression softened, not into familiarity, but into recognition, because he realized that this Omega was not taking something from him, nor giving something away. She was choosing how to meet him, and that choice, more than any ritual gesture, commanded his full attention. The ceremony could wait, tradition could adapt, and expectation could be rewritten, but this moment, defined by mutual awareness rather than assumed outcome, had already surpassed anything he had anticipated, and as he held her gaze, Rowan understood that what followed would not confirm his authority, it would challenge him to earn it in an entirely new way. Elena Moore felt the clarity of her decision settle fully into place, not as a sudden spark, but as a steady alignment between thought and instinct, and once it was there, she no longer hesitated, because choice, once claimed, did not need to be defended. She lifted her hand with deliberate calm and rested it lightly against Rowan Blackthorn's chest, not as a plea and not as a submission, but as an anchor, a way of setting the boundary of the moment she was about to define, and Rowan felt the contact register immediately, not with heat or urgency, but with surprise so sharp it stole the breath he had not realized he was holding. The hall faded further into abstraction, the distant walls and watching figures becoming peripheral as Elena stepped closer, closing the space with intention rather than momentum, and she tilted her head slightly, not upward in supplication, but forward in resolve, meeting him where he stood. Rowan did not move to guide her or close the distance himself, because he understood that to do so would shift the ownership of the moment away from her, and so he remained still, grounded, attentive, allowing her to set the pace entirely. Elena's hand remained steady as she rose just enough to bring herself level with him, and when she leaned in, the gesture was unhurried, composed, and unmistakably chosen, a quiet affirmation rather than a performance, and the contact that followed was brief, gentle, and deliberate, carrying meaning without spectacle. It was not the act itself that altered the room, but the way it was offered, free of obligation and unburdened by expectation, and Rowan felt the impact ripple through him in a way no ritual had ever managed, because in that instant he was not receiving confirmation of power, but recognition of equality in intent. When Elena drew back, she did not retreat or avert her gaze, and Rowan realized with a start that his composure had shifted, not outwardly perhaps, but internally, because the certainty he had carried into the hall had given way to something far more grounding, an awareness that what had just occurred could not be categorized or contained by tradition. The silence that followed was deep and resonant, not awkward or strained, and the pack seemed to sense it collectively, as though an unspoken understanding had passed through them, that they had just witnessed something rare, an Alpha King meeting an Omega on terms neither had inherited. Elena kept her hand where it was for a brief moment longer, then lowered it calmly, signaling completion without finality, and in that small act she reclaimed the space between them without closing it off, leaving the choice visible rather than concealed. Rowan's breath steadied again, though he was aware that something fundamental had shifted, because he understood now that the moment had not been about the ceremony or the request he had made, but about the answer she had chosen to give, and the way it had reframed his understanding of consent, authority, and connection. He met her gaze fully, without ceremony or command, and in that look was a recognition that surprised even him, because it carried gratitude rather than possession, respect rather than expectation, and the hall seemed to hold that recognition carefully, as if aware that it marked a turning point that could not be reversed. Elena felt a quiet certainty take root, not that the future was clear, but that whatever followed would be shaped by choices openly made rather than paths quietly imposed. And as she stood before the Alpha King with the ceremony still paused, and the pack still watching, she understood that her decision had not only answered a whisper, it had redefined the meaning of the moment for everyone present. The moment Elena Moore stepped back, the space she left behind did not close the way Rowan Blackthorne expected it to, and that absence struck him more forcefully than contact ever could, because it revealed how completely his composure had depended on assumptions he no longer held. He remained still, posture unchanged, yet inside him something had shifted off balance, not in a way that threatened control, but in a way that stripped it down to its core, leaving him aware of how rarely he allowed himself to be affected by another person's will. The hall waited, sensing the pause but unable to define it, and Rowan became acutely conscious of every breath he took, slower now, measured not by discipline but by recalibration, as he absorbed the fact that the moment had unfolded without his direction and had left him altered nonetheless. Elena stood calmly before him, hands at her sides, expression composed, not searching his face for approval or reaction, and that calm unsettled him more than resistance would have, because it told him she did not need reassurance to stand by her choice. Rowan felt a quiet admiration surface, unexpected and unguarded, and he allowed it to remain, because denying it would have been another attempt to regain footing through control rather than understanding. Around them, the pack remained silent, the kind of silence that forms when people sense that something irreversible has occurred, and Rowan understood that they were not waiting for him to speak so much as they were recalculating what they believed authority looked like when it chose to listen. He became aware then that for the first time in years, he did not know exactly what his next words would be, and instead of rushing to fill that space, he allowed it to exist, recognizing that the absence of immediate declaration was not weakness but respect for what had just transpired. Elena met his gaze again, steady and unflinching, and Rowan realized that what had unsettled him was not the act she had chosen, but the clarity with which she had chosen it, because it reflected a strength that did not challenge him directly yet refused to bend around him. The realization settled deeply, reshaping his understanding of influence, because he saw now that true authority did not require dominance to be effective, it required recognition of others as complete agents within its reach. The ceremonial attendants shifted subtly at the edges of the hall, unsure whether to proceed, and Rowan lifted one hand slightly, not to command action, but to signal patience, and that small gesture carried more weight than any formal order he could have given, because it affirmed that the pause remained intentional. Elena felt the atmosphere steady around them, and though she remained quiet, she understood that her choice had already spoken, not just to him but to everyone watching, and she did not need to elaborate or justify it. Rowan took a measured breath and felt the last remnants of his expectation fall away, replaced by something more grounded, a respect that did not depend on rank or ritual, and as he looked at Elena, he understood that whatever followed would be shaped not by what he claimed, but by what they acknowledged together. The ceremony had not resumed, the hall had not returned to routine, and Rowan recognized that he would not want it to, because the moment they had just shared had revealed a path forward that could not be found through tradition alone, and standing there with the pack watching and the future momentarily unwritten, he accepted that he had been changed, quietly and undeniably, by an Omega who had chosen not to be defined by expectation, and by doing so, had redefined him as well. The silence that followed did not feel empty but charged, as if the hall itself were listening, and Rowan Blackthorne sensed that every eye was on him now, not with expectation of command, but with curiosity about what kind of authority would emerge next. He remained still for a moment longer, allowing that attention to exist without resisting it, because he understood that speaking too quickly would collapse the significance of what had just occurred into something familiar and smaller than it deserved. Elena Moore stood beside him with composed ease, not pressing forward and not retreating, her presence steady enough to remind him that this was no longer a solitary decision masked as tradition. Rowan lifted his gaze to the gathered pack at last, and in doing so he felt the weight of their history settle against the present, a reminder that every ceremony they had ever witnessed had taught them what to expect, never what to imagine. He spoke then, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber without being raised, and he did not declare the ceremony resumed or postponed, but acknowledged that a choice had been made in full awareness, and that such a choice deserved to be recognized before anything else continued. The effect was immediate and profound, not in outward reaction but in the subtle recalibration of attention, as though the pack collectively adjusted its understanding of what authority could sound like when it chose transparency over inevitability. Elena felt the shift as well, a quiet affirmation that her decision had not been absorbed or diminished, but named and respected, and she remained where she was, trusting that her stillness spoke clearly enough. Rowan turned back to her briefly, not to seek confirmation, but to include her presence in what came next, and that inclusion carried a weight she felt deeply, because it confirmed that she was no longer an object within the ceremony, but a participant shaping its course. The ceremonial attendants waited at the edges, uncertain but attentive, and Rowan signaled again for patience, reinforcing that the pause remained intentional and protected, and that gesture alone communicated more than any rigid adherence to protocol could have. The pack's silence deepened, not with tension but with understanding, and Elena sensed that something fundamental had settled into place, that the moment had crossed from personal to communal significance without losing its integrity. Rowan became aware then of how the future would remember this night, not as a disruption, but as a turning point where tradition had been allowed to breathe, and he accepted that responsibility with a steadiness he had not anticipated. Elena felt no urge to speak, because she recognized that her choice had already done its work, and she allowed the space to remain open, trusting that clarity did not require repetition. The hall seemed warmer now, not in temperature but in tone, as if the stone itself responded to the shift, and Rowan understood that the ceremony, when it continued, would do so on altered ground, informed by consent rather than assumption. He looked once more at Elena, not as a figure waiting to be claimed, but as someone whose agency had redefined the meaning of the rite itself, and in that look was a quiet resolve to honor what had been revealed rather than contain it. The silence held, deliberate and unbroken, and in that held moment, both of them understood that the true significance of what had occurred lay not in spectacle or declaration, but in the collective recognition that choice, once respected, changed everything that followed. Rowan Blackthorne felt the moment settle into certainty, not imposed but earned, and as he looked out across the hall one final time, he understood that the future would be shaped by how he named what had already been recognized. He turned to Elena Moore and extended his hand, not as a command and not as a claim, but as an invitation made visible, and he waited without assumption, allowing her the same space she had claimed from the beginning. Elena regarded the offered hand with calm consideration, aware of the significance it carried and equally aware that acceptance, if it came, would be on her terms, and when she placed her hand in his, the contact was steady and deliberate, a continuation rather than a culmination, and the hall seemed to exhale as one. Rowan faced the pack again, his voice clear and grounded, and he spoke not of destiny imposed or rank fulfilled, but of a choice made openly and honored fully, stating that what mattered was not that he had asked, but that she had chosen, and that this choice, witnessed by all, would guide what came next. The words carried through the chamber with quiet authority, reshaping the understanding of the ceremony without diminishing its meaning, and Elena felt the recognition settle around her like a mantle she had not been forced to wear. Rowan did not rush to continue the ritual, because he understood that naming the truth was the ritual now, and he affirmed that the bond they would consider would be built on consent and mutual regard, not assumption, and that such a foundation strengthened the realm rather than weakened it. The pack listened in attentive silence, absorbing a declaration that reframed power as something responsive rather than rigid, and Elena sensed that her presence had shifted from peripheral to pivotal. Without spectacle or demand, Rowan turned to her once more, his expression composed yet open, and acknowledged her directly, stating that she had chosen him, and that her choice had changed everything, not with flourish, but with the weight of sincerity that needed no embellishment. Elena felt a quiet warmth spread through her chest, not triumph, but assurance, because the moment had been honored exactly as she had intended, without being taken from her or reshaped by expectation. The ceremonial attendants stepped forward at last, moving with care, as if aware that the ground beneath tradition had subtly shifted, and Rowan allowed the proceedings to resume at a measured pace, ensuring that nothing moved faster than the understanding already established. Elena remained at his side, not elevated above others and not hidden among them, simply present, her agency intact and visible, and she recognized that whatever followed would be navigated together rather than decided for her. As the first formal words of the rite were spoken anew, the hall felt different, steadier, informed by a shared recognition that authority had listened and choice had been honored, and Rowan felt a resolve settle into place, knowing that leadership rooted in respect would endure. Elena met his gaze one last time before facing forward, her posture calm and confident, and she understood that the future was not promised or predetermined, but open, shaped by decisions made with clarity and care. The ceremony continued, not as it had been planned, but as it had become, and in that transformation lay the true significance of the night, where destiny had not commanded, but bowed, and choice had led the way.